Season 2. Hey everybody, it's Ben. Feels really great to be back, especially given the fact that I get to say hello to a lot of new listeners. Just looking at the analytics, lots and lots of people have come to find the podcast since the end of Season 1. And that has led to a steady stream of emails with support for the show, or questions about Tourette syndrome, or interest in being interviewed. And every bit of it has just really, really made me nervous. Because I don't want to get this wrong. I want to make sure this podcast is as good as it can be, given the bandwidth and resources I have. And it got me thinking about, what could I do to really take this show to the next level? Is it going to be new segments or other hooks and features that kind of up the dynamics of the podcast? I was trying to think of new things, but as I was jotting ideas for this, the common thread through the emails I was getting was that people just kind of liked the format as is, because the simplicity of it and the casualness of it, I guess, kind of proves the sincerity of the conversation, if that makes sense. And this kind of unscripted conversation is what people want, because it's real. And when people are talking honestly about their lives, that's when you can find what, you can truly relate to. And the beauty of that, which I didn't realize when I first launched the podcast, is that anybody can dig an honest, personal story, no matter who you are. Whether you have Tourette syndrome or, the common cold, doesn't matter. We do have non-Tourette people listening. I know because I've heard from some of them. They found the podcast somehow and tuned in to listen because they were curious. Then there are non-Tourette people who I know personally, and I know they're listening because I've quizzed them about it. But what's really taken off here is the fact that people with Tourette syndrome, who don't normally get to see or hear themselves reflected in external conversation, and don't always see themselves in the more popular portrayals, can maybe find identity and community in conversations we have here. The major consistent thing they've said is that just hearing conversations like the kind we have on this podcast makes them feel less isolated. Less isolated is always the phrase that I get from listeners, which is really significant and meaningful because, again, that makes it about everybody. Feeling comfortable with the world you live in. You shouldn't have to worry about what's in the heads of other people when it comes to you just doing your thing. And that was a new realization for me in 2018 when this podcast started. Go back to episode 0 of season 1 to kind of get the backstory behind this. But again, a lot of other people saying the same thing, that they feel less isolated, which is obviously way more than I ever imagined will come out of this. So this is episode 0 of season 2, just my way of getting up to speed before we move on to episode 1, which I'm releasing today as well. And I gotta say, episode 1 starts strong with our first conversation with Jaleesa. But hang out with me here first, because we're gonna hear from you. I've gotten a lot of questions and comments that I want to bring onto this show, and I want you to help me respond to them. But a couple more quick updates. Okay, so we've established that we're just charging forward with the same anti-formula as before. Nothing more complex than an honest conversation. That's it. And thanks to my better half, Ambrose, she did some things behind the scenes, and I got to promote what the Tourette's podcast is on a very, very popular podcast called For Crying Out Loud. It's hosted by Lynette Carolla and Stephanie Wilder. It's from the Podcast One network. Very popular. So mainly what Lynette and Stephanie do, they're known for these really kind of funny and raw talks about parenting and childhood situations and what happens with their kids at school, that kind of thing. So Ambrose, she connected me with them, and I recorded an interview with Stephanie Wilder about Tourette's podcast. And that was awesome. It's definitely worth noting that Stephanie is the mother of a child with a chronic tic disorder. So it was absolutely relevant, and it reached a lot of people. And while we were talking, Stephanie said, dude, you gotta have a Facebook group. For your podcast, you have to have a Facebook group, which is something I said I would do in season 1, and I totally let that get away from me, even though some of you totally volunteered to do it. And I take responsibility for that not materializing as it should have. But that is happening now. I'm working with some volunteers to put the Facebook group together. I'll have better details very soon, but we're not dropping the ball on that Tourette's Podcast Facebook group happening. And even though I'm not on Facebook and I don't plan on being on Facebook, just kind of a personal thing, that is one place to go to talk about this podcast. And I guess I should monitor that to see what I might need to know in terms of communication, ideas, answers to questions we put out there. Again, the Facebook group will be a place to kind of corral all this information. I do get a lot of questions that I don't consider myself qualified enough to answer, especially the parenting questions, though I do try. But I do think a lot of you, listeners, will be able to better answer these questions. So this is a platform for the discussion. But just to start us off, let me go ahead and open up the mailbag and read off some questions and scenarios that you guys can help to answer or address for the person asking. These are really good questions and often come from people who, like most people, don't have a background with Tourette syndrome, don't have experience with it, and aren't sure how to proceed with certain things. For example, there are a lot of parents whose kids are newly diagnosed, and they're looking for resources, they're looking for answers. And the questions they come up with are totally from the context of their worlds. If you ask me, there's no such thing as a bad question when it comes to kind of seeking solutions and information about Tourette syndrome. So anyway, let me just play you one.
Hi Ben, my name is Mike. I'm calling from the UK. I've been listening to your podcast for about a month or so. I think I'm up to episode 4 or 5. I think the podcast is absolutely brilliant. The interviews with different people and the experiences they share, the source of information is invaluable. I basically have a question regarding my son. He is 9 and he was diagnosed with Tourette's about 3 years ago. His episodes have kind of waxed and waned over the years, from a point of nothing, no tics whatsoever, some weeks and months, to shoulder shrugging, blinking, coughing, probably at its worst. But at the moment, it's relatively quiet. He doesn't seem to have many tics at all. We've tried to manage it through homeopathic route, which I'm not 100% sure whether it's working, because his episodes wax and wane over the few years that we've given him homeopathic medicine. My question is, we've never actually told him he has Tourette's. We've discussed his tics with him, but never told him or anybody else that he has Tourette's. But last week he had an episode at school, an incident at school. We had to tell the teachers, that what his condition was, and they were perfectly supportive and gave us lots of help and were very understanding. But I need to know, from your experience, what do you think I should tell him about his condition? Do I actually tell him that he has Tourette's? When should I tell him? I noticed that, I remember that you had a couple of guests on, and they were discussing that when they were told that they have Tourette's, it was a great relief. They found that they could actually put a label to what they were dealing with. So I just basically want some advice, and any information you can give me would be great. Thanks for all your help. Keep the podcast going. It's absolutely brilliant. Okay, bye.
Hi, Ben. This is Christine Conalia reaching out to you from Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I'm a scientist and a clinical psychologist who focuses on Tourette's. I have 2 questions for you that relate to these different jobs I do. First, what aspect of Tourette's do you most wish scientists would study? In other words, if you could set the research agenda, what would be your top priority? Second, I'm wondering what you wish healthcare professionals most understood about what it's like to have Tourette's. Thanks.
I love getting these questions in audio format. Best way to do it, because I can just drop it right in here on the show. Your voice, your questions. Tourette'sPodcast@gmail.com is the place to send them. Just record a voice memo on your smartphone and send me the file. Easiest way to do it. If you'd rather type it out, just send me a text email. I'm totally okay with that. No problem. Actually, let me get to some of those and then I'll answer Christine's questions. Meanwhile, I would love for you to think about Mike's question as well and how you would answer it. Let me know what you think, what your thoughts are, what your answers are. Send me a voice memo. I'll play your thoughts on the show. You can send me an email too. Here's something from Alyssa. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. She says, the biggest question I have right now is how to help my son, he's 11, when his tics cause him pain. His new one is where he has to keep biting down over and over, and it makes his jaw really sore. Another question is how to help him fall asleep when tics are keeping him up. So a pair of questions from Alyssa. What do you guys think? What input do you have to help Alyssa and her son? And here's one from someone who would like to remain anonymous, and that's totally okay. I respect that. This person says, hi, I'm a mother of a 7-year-old boy with Tourette syndrome, diagnosed a few months ago. I heard you talking about the conferences you attended, referring to the conferences I attended when I was a little kid. So she says, earlier this year, I met a mother of a boy in his late teens who suggested I go and even bring my son. At the time, we still didn't have the diagnosis. I would consider it for next year, but I feel I may be forcing him to attend and meet children who present symptoms that are scary to him. I've also considered going without him. Any thoughts or words of wisdom? All right, so what do you guys think of that? How would you respond to that? I will say really quick, I did reply to this person and I said that, I totally get it, but that for me, attending Tourette's conferences when I was a kid kind of helped me to kind of get an appreciation for how many people I could relate to, even if they had way more intense tics than I had. I did see things that I thought were kind of alarming and kind of scary to me when I was a little kid. But overall, it helped me understand my own tics and kind of finding my context and finding support as well that I didn't have before. So you remember me talking about Shane Fistel and Steve Bachner and people like that who kind of reached out to me and they knew what I was going through. And just that little bit of communication really went a long way with me. And I felt part of something bigger, if that makes sense. So I told this listener, it wouldn't hurt to attend one of these conferences herself and just kind of see what it's like, but it could also be a help to her son in just being there and connecting with people. All right, here's a question from Jamie. The subject line is Closeted Hubby. It says, Ben, my husband has Tourette's, and he's not formally been diagnosed, but I can say with 100% certainty that he has it. Obviously, I'm not qualified to diagnose TS, but I'm a special education teacher, and I've been witness to a wealth of complex neurological issues for many years, and everything in me believes it. My husband has suffered with his unwieldy passenger since 2nd or 3rd grade and suppresses his complex vocal tics, which often include coprolalia, while around other people, but is able to let them out while at work, as he works alone and is in isolation most of the time. I've never heard the complex vocal tics, but have observed his other hidden vocal tics and motor tics for the duration of our relationship, over 17 years. Sadly, I'm the only person he's ever told about his TS. He's completely closeted and feels deeply shameful about it, having suffered alone with it for so long. To be honest, compared to the other things he's suffered in his life, TS seems like nothing. He's adopted, became a father to identical twins at age 16, lost both parents to cancer by age 20, and also suffers with ADHD, depression, anxiety, PTSD, severe insomnia, and post-concussive syndrome. Despite all of this, he's a fantastic father, a hard worker, has a genius-level IQ, is a talented musician, and has myriad other creative talents. To be honest, I'm absolutely in awe of him. He is the most complex, interesting, intelligent, and resilient person I know, and I don't think he realizes just how awesome he is. Okay, so she goes on to say that she's trying to convince him to listen to the podcast and I guess create that connection with other people who do have Tourette syndrome. She says, because I know he would find commonalities that would allow him to feel much better about himself. At this point, because of all of his shame and isolation, I think he would gladly say he wishes he did not have Tourette's. As his wife, I can't imagine him without it. I know if taken away, he would not be the beautiful person I see when I look at him. I just hope he can see what a beautiful person he is someday. Yeah, so, everybody weigh in on this. I've gotten other kind of similar emails from people who are close to somebody else who has Tourette syndrome and they feel kind of shameful about it, don't want to talk about it with other people, don't even really know how to open the door to kind of begin that change in life. This could go so many different ways, but I'm curious to hear what you guys think. By the way, tourettespodcast@gmail.com is the place to send your feedback for right now. You can also connect on Twitter @Tourette'sPod. And then the Facebook group is coming. Promise. So I think that's pretty good to start us off. I've got a lot of other emails in the queue. Keep them coming. We're going to get to them. if we're adding any new kind of segments here, I think this is a good one to do. Sort of a listener mailbag where you can help answer the questions. All right, so let me get back to Christine's questions. All right, so remember, it was a two-parter. So I'll just take it one by one. First part was, what aspect of Tourette syndrome do you most wish that scientists would study? And just to preface, I know my own context with Tourette syndrome, having lived with it. I haven't followed scientific study very closely, I'm kind of ashamed to say, especially as a science and research junkie. So I don't know what has been studied and what hasn't, but I would have to say, just given the open end, that I'd love to see study of the advantages of Tourette syndrome. It seems like so often we hear about people who have these sort of creative or technical proclivities and kind of extra emphases in their life on doing something exceptionally well. I hope that doesn't come off the wrong way, but it's just something we hear all the time. Seem to be these sort of common denominators involving music and art or technical smarts. And why is that? Is it a myth? Is it real? So much testimony about it, so much anecdotal evidence anyway. I'd love to kind of see that fleshed out. Regarding the brain and the sort of impact of Tourette syndrome on the brain and how we process our information, what our interests are, a lot of that obviously has to do with the environment around us and sort of, information that's presented to us and what our upbringing is like. But again, we just so often hear about these sort of creative and technical advantages when it comes to people who have Tourette syndrome. If that's already been studied, I'd love to talk about it with somebody, especially you, Christine, if you are familiar with that. Christine, I think, would be somebody great to have on the show, just to kind of talk about the research that she's doing with Tourette syndrome. Okay, so the second part was, what do I wish healthcare professionals would most understand about having Tourette syndrome or living with it? And I hope this isn't a bad answer, but it seems like we also often hear from people who have to kind of fight to get the diagnosis. People who maybe have had Tourette symptoms since they were a kid, but as adults, they go to visit their doctor and say, I think this might be Tourette syndrome. I've read up about it. Everything's very consistent with what I'm living with. And, I'd like to treat it somehow, or at least understand it or come to terms with it better. And then they have to kind of fight for that diagnosis, or it's dismissed. So you'll hear in some of the interviews coming up this season where doctors have told people to, try Botox in the area where they're twitching, or even just take Tylenol. No kidding. You'll hear about this stuff, especially the Botox part. And I think it just kind of creates a frustration when people are, familiar enough with themselves to where they're like, wait a minute, Tylenol is not going to help me out with, and I'm using Tylenol as just kind of a generic example here of maybe some sort of medical ignorance. But we just hear it time and again. That Tourette syndrome, obviously it can be very prevalent in adults. It's not just a childhood tic disorder. Symptoms may present when you're a child, but it may take somebody a long time to get to the point where they go to the doctor to do something about it if they feel like that's what they need to do, or at least get the diagnosis so they have an answer. And there may be skepticism or a hesitancy on part of the doctor, partly because maybe just the lack of information that the doctor has or the lack of experience the doctor has with something like Tourette syndrome or tic disorders in general. Full respect given to the medical community. Again, I'm a science junkie, so I got to give full respect to all the doctors who are doing it right. But if there's something that I wish healthcare professionals would understand about living with Tourette syndrome, it's maybe just listen. This is a real thing. As I'm talking, I feel like this is kind of a bad answer, but based on the feedback I get, emails I get, there is some frustration there. Anyway, Christine, thank you so much for your questions. I hope I answered them right. Hope that was helpful in some way. So yeah, keep them coming. These are really great. These are really great questions. Please keep them coming. Tourette'sPodcast@gmail.com is the email address. On Twitter @Tourette'sPod. Facebook group in the works. And I think it's about time that we get to episode 1 with Jaleesa. She really, really brings it. Amazing way to start the second season. By the way, these interviews are awesome. We're going to be doing this weekly, just like last time. Every Friday, new episode. The cool part, I think, is that after season 1, so again, we had a big bump in listenership and sort of interaction after season 1 ended. So a lot of people at this point very familiar with the format, the sort of conversational style, the freewheeling nature of the talks we have on this podcast. Last time, I had already completed all of the interviews before I did the first episode. So there wasn't as much familiarity. And now people, I think, have shown some comfort with it, some understanding of how things are going to be going, what questions I'm going to ask. You hear a lot of the same questions, but the answers that we get are very diverse. Yet still, as different as everyone's story is, you're still going to find things to relate to. All these eureka moments and all these like, oh man, that's exactly what I go through. You're going to hear that. I think also this season is going to kind of grow and evolve. I'm not recording all these episodes in advance. I'm kind of doing it week by week so we can make it more of a conversation, more organic. But okay, I'm going to shut up and we're going to get to Jaleesa. If you've already subscribed to this podcast on iTunes or Google Play, whatever your favorite podcast app is, you should already have that episode waiting for you. Otherwise, go to tourettespodcast.libsyn.com. Libsyn is spelled Libsyn. So that's the hosting site, tourettespodcast.libsyn.com. Or just go ahead and subscribe. Find it on iTunes. Just type in Tourette's Podcast into the search, Google Play, Stitcher, Overcast, Spotify. If there's a certain podcast platform you like and you don't find the Tourette's Podcast there, let me know so I can fix that. All right. Thanks again for bearing with me. Episode 0. This has been, let's get to episode 1, season 2, Tourette's Podcast.